now. Okay. Yes, Andrew, you can start.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Thanks for that really nice introduction. Hi, everyone. Really great to be here with you today. Looking forward to introducing organizational network analysis and the insight that comes from these areas. I'm going to take you through some, background information on it, also a little bit of the history, and also how it's used in practice to sort of bring it alive for your understanding. And so I'm from the UK originally, work with Mentis. I'm the chief executive. I'm currently in Dubai. I'm at a conference. I lived here for 9 years, but I'm now based in Bangkok and have been for the last 2 years, and travel around Southeast Asia and the Middle East, South Asia a lot. And it's just real pleasure to be invited to speak to you today. I will welcome any questions. We will have a Q&A at the end. I'll be sharing my screen. It's currently disabled for me at the moment, Rachel. Sorry, if that's able to be released, that'll be great. So please do come with any questions anytime, maybe in the chat. I'll try my best to see what they are, and then we'll have a nice Q&A at the end.
So I've just changed you to host, so you should be able to share.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. So let's come in. And that should be coming through to everybody now, hopefully, with a little bit of luck. Let's see, just showed up. Great. Okay, so here's a horrible picture of me. Sorry about that. This is a few of my details. There's me on LinkedIn as well, so please feel free to reach out. Mentis is 20 years old. We were founded in London in 2003, and we have offices in Dubai, Bangkok. Our technology team is in Cebu. Technology development team is in Cebu in the Philippines. And whilst we were founded in the UK in 2003, our headquarters and holding company is now based in Singapore. With our 2 decades of global experience, we have been developing or been really interested in understanding what organizational network analysis is and how it can actually help people work better together. This is a journey that we're on at the moment. We have advanced it more than most people have managed around the world, I believe, and that's also feedback that we've been given. There aren't that many people trying to advance it at the moment, but I do feel that it's got the potential to be one of the things that really impacts how we look at talent and talent management and talent development in the future, and I'll unpack that a little bit more shortly. So we're living in a very unique time. There's lots of different unique times in the past for various different reasons. The reason why our time is so unique is we do have a whole new set of challenges. We've just had a global pandemic like no one could probably really imagine. And it's never been tougher to lead and manage people in the modern era than now. The virtual world, in person, different generations, technology influencing how we work, and this key concept of productivity really comes through. Global organizations have been facing productivity challenges way before the actual pandemic. We'll look at a little bit data soon. Also, the way individuals actually value work has been compromised, and we'll have a little look in that as well. And it's just getting harder to identify who's operating in what role, how and why and where, and how are we going to actually start to try and address some of these issues that are coming through. So if we have a look at productivity, here's some information that comes through. This is from some Bank of America global research looking at S&P 500 and the number of employees per $1 million of revenue generated. And you can see from the 80s into the 90s, the number of employees per 1 million revenue was coming down. So an indicator of greater productivity, more from less people. But then as you get to about the turn of the century, the change of the millennium, it's still coming down up until about 2010. So we're at about 3 people per $1 million revenue generated for the S&P 500, but it's really started to plateau across the last decade. And if anything, since we've hit the 2020s, we're starting to see the number of employees per $1 million start to actually go up. So productivity has been an issue. Why has productivity growth slowed, even though technology has been advancing as it is? Do we have too much tech? Are we distracted by technology more? Our phones are constantly pinging us information, constantly coming back with stuff. It's actually filtering algorithms that are very, very clever, that actually limits what we see and actually channels us towards, the stuff that we're expecting to see and can move stuff away. We're much more risk averse because of the internet. We're very careful about what we do, what we say, what we put out there, because it can be captured, it can be recorded, it can be posted, and these things can be jumped on very quickly. Big discussion about the working week, 5 days versus 4 days, and then how are we getting on with our organizational design? These are all question marks that are really coming through at the moment, and we're not necessarily answering the questions at the moment. There's lots of questions, more questions being asked than answers coming through. And here's a nice little illustration around, if I just move some of these out the way. As we add more people into the mix, connections increase, but the complexity increases faster than productivity. So how many times have we got a problem or an issue that we need to overcome? By bringing more people into that discussion, the number of connections increases far quicker than the number of people you bring in. The complexity, you have to overcome barriers of complexity before you can get to productivity. So by introducing more people into the discussion to solve an issue, you're not necessarily speeding up the time you're going to get to a conclusion or a resolution, unless you're working seamlessly to overcome the complexity issue that you have just created for yourselves. Nice simple illustration, but 3 people, 3 lines. By the time you get to 14 people, it's 91 lines. Not all those 91 lines will exist, but that complexity really adds a barrier to what we're trying to do. So this connection element is coming across very strongly. One other factor here as well is the global trends are emerging, and they seem to be reasonably consistent. But depending on where you are in the world, business leaders are going to need different solutions in different regions to address the challenges. Europe is possibly going to need something different to Asia. If we look at Asia, the super age population, particularly in Southeast Asia, is coming across quite strongly. By 2050. Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan will have well over a third of their population super aged, etc. So the supply of talent, etc. Within India as well, you're going to get different challenges that's going to need different approaches, and there's not going to be a one size fits all. And again, this just adds to the challenge that managers and leaders have at the moment. And a lot of literature that's coming out of some of the big consulting firms is around just how impossible it is for managers at the moment, and the fact that we're expecting too much from them. So if we have a look at how we value work as well, this is not a change. So this information that comes from Gartner as we sort of set the scene. This came from last year. And when we look at how people actually value work, they identify 3 main categories. The largest category was work as a transaction. People like to come in, give their expertise, give their knowledge, use their hands, be present, and receive something in return, usually remuneration. And that works quite well for a lot of us. For 1/5 of us, 20% of us, we value work as a world. We see it as a community, as an extension of our world, as a universe. We like to feel connected and close to that area. And then approximately 13% of us, we value work as an identity. It's got to resonate with our values. It's got to resonate directly with what we like to do and how we like to do it. Post-COVID, this has mixed a lot of things up. For the first time ever, when it comes to work as a transaction, you're seeing a non-financial factor being cited more as the reason for people leaving. So they had 44% of employees who left citing compensation as the reason, but 45% of employees who cited burnout. So all of a sudden, this idea of just coming into work, receiving something in return is still valid, but it's becoming much more about non-financial factors. We're reflecting more deeply on what's important to us. A very obvious one around world as work, it's been shrinking. We've all been locked up, we've come back, the hybrid working, we're spending less time in the office, we're having fewer interactions. And this is helping us sort of think work as a transaction and work as a world has been really compromised, and we've really been reflecting on what this actually means to us. And then a lot of us have been taking a step back and reflecting much more on the bottom one. Identifying with work is becoming increasingly important. Do I actually believe and recognize the purpose of what we're trying to do as a business? And over half of us are saying that the pandemic has really made us question the purpose of our day-to-day jobs. So it's really mixed a lot of things up in this area, and it'll be really interesting to see what the 2023 survey says and whether people that are people that value work as an identity, whether that percentage has increased. Yes, it certainly seems like people are thinking about it. So let's have a little move from this. So we've got these challenges at the moment. The challenges will evolve. These are the ones that we've got currently. So where does organizational network analysis come into this, and where has it come from? So it's the statistical and graphical analysis of the human networks and relationships that drive the workplace performance. And some of the first sociographs were produced by somebody called Dr. Moreno in the 1930s. And we're going to look a little bit more into that shortly. But it just was not able to go mainstream because the available technology, the speed of the mathematics, etc., there was just no point. It took several years for Dr. Moreno to complete his study. That's obviously not practically beneficial for an organization in real terms to use it to manage and help their people work better together. But since 2010, graph analysis, technology advances, they've started to make ONA feasible for the mainstream. It can operate and the data can come through in the time zones required to actually analyze and then do something about it if you want to. The big element here with organizational network analysis is we're introducing a whole new concept. The concept we're introducing here is social capital. Capital being a resource. We talk about working capital, that's our financial resource. How much money do we have to invest and build? And when we talk about people, historically, because we haven't had anything else to support us, historically, we talk about people in terms of human capital. We talk about the individual as being the resource. So this resource of the individual, they bring their work, their knowledge, their expertise, their skills, and help that organization advance. And then they, as themselves, increase their ability to be a resource. They develop themselves. And that is very, very valid. But people don't just bring themselves as a resource to an organization. They create the resource of the network that's created between the people. And for me, this social capital piece has been the missing piece of the puzzle. We try and jump from human capital data, individual data, personality, psychometric assessments, etc., competency feedback, and then jump to the results and the outcomes because we've had nothing else to do. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's been done quite effectively by people who really care about this. But you really want to be looking at human capital into social capital, into the outcomes, and understand that people have the resource of them as an individual, but the resource of the networks that they create with others. And if we look at how this has actually been impacting due to the COVID pandemic, you see here in terms of people reporting investing in their network, investing in their connections, creating social capital with the people around them, accessing the resource of the network around them. You're seeing that middle managers and frontline workers, in terms of getting in touch with old contacts, building new relationships, strengthening existing relationships, is very low, particularly frontline workers. 80% plus are not doing any of this. 60% plus, 65% plus for middle managers have not been doing this. People's networks have been shrinking. And even though senior managers and senior leaders are reporting higher, senior leaders are in a privileged position. They're motivated to build and maintain those relationships. They're privileged to have the access to employees to be able to do this. And by their career path, they more than likely have the ability. But your productivity within an organization doesn't come from your senior managers. Productivity within an organization comes from your middle managers and frontline workers. And here they're allowing, those connections between these groups is reducing. And this would suggest that the social capital between these groups is reducing. So you're weakening your resource. And this is amplified by this information from a McKinsey study in March last year. We know that employees who feel more connected with people in their networks, they're 1.5 times more likely than their peers to report being engaged at work. But when we have a look at what people are reporting post-pandemic about, has your network grown? Do you feel more connected? Do you get more contact? You're talking about 90% of frontline workers reporting that it's either stayed the same or got less. You're talking about 80% of middle managers saying that their network has either stayed the same or got less. The social capital is going backwards. This resource of network has been shrinking, and we have been struggling to find ways of dealing with that over the last 3 years. We talk about hybrid working, and hybrid working is a very important topic, but for me, hybrid working is a secondary point. The first point, and what organizations are trying to achieve, and individuals, is to be working, to be productive and also be engaged, positively engaged, while increasing that productivity. What we're seeing happen now is when we look at this social capital, we're not actually measuring this resource. We're looking at human capital, but we're not thinking about the social capital. It's like the engine of the people. You think about a Formula One engine or a sports car engine. There's lots of different pieces within that, and how they come together really has a massive impact on the speed and the efficiency of how that car can actually move and run. The senior managers, it comes down to social capital. They want to know how their people engine is coming together and what resource do they have. Do I have a Formula One car, or do I have a general day-to-day family run around car? Where am I at? What's going on? And we've seen this friction and tension occur between talent professionals and senior leaders. It varies depending on where you are. Sometimes it can move from tension to all-out friction, because talent professionals, they're looking at the human capital, they're helping people get better, and what they're doing is they're increasing the social quotient of the individual's ability to access social capital, but they're not using that language, and they're struggling to make the jump across to the social capital, which looks at the people as a resource, which is what the senior leaders are really wanting to understand. So how can we help to give talent professionals a much more strategic voice? How can we help people talk in similar language so that we understand where everybody's coming from? And how can we give this valuable insight into senior leaders and decision makers on the strength of their people network, which is ironic because these elements of the people network can be overlooked so often, whereas, without people, there is no company. So how do we bring this all together when we look at organizational network analysis as a topic? So on the left-hand side, we have the organizational chart, very clear. A lot of organizations have this. This gives us a bit of useful information. It tells us who's accountable. It tells us who applies to who for annual leave. It gives us a little bit of indication of salary bands. But the reality is no group of human beings have ever behaved in a way that creates a network like that left-hand side. Oh, sorry. On the right-hand side is a much more accurate reflection of what will start to happen. People will create connections. It's a living, breathing organism that's moving. New connections will be formed. Some connections will move. And it's how people are actually coming together. And we call it the informal network, but it's actually the informal network, which is your social capital, which dictates how efficiently and how well you as an organization can get things done. And it also from not just from an organizational strategic perspective, but it also links into the environment for the colleagues, the culture for the colleagues, the psychological safety for the colleagues, diversity and inclusion. A lot of organizations tick the box of being diverse, but is there inclusion? It's not inclusion if you've got different groups of diversity all siloed together. So how can we look at how these connections are building? And so we start to work backwards. We're not starting with the people, we're going to end with the people. We have a look at the network. And from an organizational network perspective, it's like, what has influenced how this network has formed? It's constantly moving, constantly ebbing and flowing. It's the first question is not whether this is good or bad, it's what's influenced how this is formed. And one of the first things we look at is structural. And this falls under the category of potential quick wins. Organizations try and set up to be as efficient as possible, but they have to make decisions. Not every decision translates out how we expect. And you're never going to get a more obvious example of a structural impact than when we had COVID. That's a very extreme one, but we all had to start working from home. That is going to impact how the network and the connections exist. But it can also go down to things that are really small and really mundane. You know, everybody on the second floor is not speaking to everybody on the third floor. The lifts are broken and nobody can be bothered using the stairs. Or we've put a group in building A and there's a group in building B, but we don't actually get people together. So there's actual physical distance. And so those connections don't start to build. So looking at the network, seeing if there's anything structural that can give us advantages or anything that we've accidentally done that's structural, that's not allowing the network and the connections to form as we want. The second quick win we look at is process and policies. Organizations have rules, they have ways of interacting. They're in nearly every single case, they're designed with good intentions. How can we make things as efficient and as slick as possible? Who do you have to go to ask for different pieces of advice, etc.? But this can help facilitate connections, but processes and policies can accidentally stop connections. Information has to flow in a certain way, people follow that certain way, and it stops connections happening either side of that. And then we move to the final one. And this was where we go much deeper. This is not a quick win. This is the people themselves, how they behave, how they interact, how their reputation is viewed by other people, etc. And this links us then into that human capital area very strongly as we start to expand out. So this is the premise behind when we look at organizational network analysis. We're looking at the people, but we're looking at the sum of the parts of the people. And it's like the second piece of the puzzle that gives us greater insight so that we can help the individuals, help the network, and help the organization. Win-win-win. So where did this all come from? So here's a little bit of history, sort of. So actually go all the way back to the 1700s. And this is the 7 bridges of Königsberg, which is in modern day Kaliningrad in the north of Europe. There was the romanticized version of the story is that the king of Königsberg was interested in setting the challenge of sightseeing. Is it possible to sightsee the whole of Königsberg, see all of the places, and cross each bridge just once? So the most efficient path to seeing the whole city with no repeats. And this task was sort of taken on. And it was reduced down into the first theorem of graph theory. So a very famous mathematician, Euler, was able to take the diagram of the bridges and reduce this right down into what they call nodes and edges. So nodes being the dots, edges being the lines, and was able to prove that it cannot be done. So you must have 2 nodes with even edge numbers. So you must have at least 2 nodes where you can go in and you can go out, and then you can solve it. So through the mathematics, he developed the first idea of graph theorem and was able to prove that you could not sightsee the whole of Königsberg, cross each bridge once and not repeat yourself. But it took another 200 years for this to really come through. So we had the graph theorem, We had this great idea of this elements, but the first social network analysis, and you can see a picture of one of the original drawings here, didn't actually come through until the early 1900s with somebody called Dr. Moreno. So Dr. Moreno was been adding to the work that had been done previously, but was looking at doing the first social network graphs while studying the seating preferences of children from kindergarten to 8th grade. So it took 8 years of study, 8 years of observing. From the 8 years of observing, that took him up to 1934. And by drawing these first connected graphs, was able to see that there was silos that were evolving over time. There was in and out groups. You see boys and girls separating and then coming back together. You've got isolated individuals, you've got brokers, you've got unreciprocated links where one person has a connection but the other person doesn't. And what I find really interesting from this particular study is that the teachers of the children, so the teachers that were observing the children through the whole academic year with them all sat in front of them, in terms of predicting who was more central to the network, the accuracy was only 25 to 60%, depending on which teacher and which year, which is remarkably low considering they were able to observe the seating patterns of the individuals naturally through the whole of the academic year. And I think what this starts to tell us is that it's almost impossible for human beings to intuitively pick up and read the informal networks that are occurring. So therefore, it's absolutely impossible for our managers and our leaders in the workplace to be able to intuitively gauge this accurately. And then if you throw in the fact that they're not actually working alongside their colleagues, it's an impossible task. So here's an example of the data. They were turned into nice studies. You can see in first grade, everybody was all joined together. Third grade, you started to get some splitting, same into fourth grade. Here you've got sixth grade, where the boys and the girls realize that they don't like each other. The girls have got cooties and the boys smell, so we're going to keep it away from each other. But then you move into the seventh grade and the eighth grade, and actually you realize we do like each other. We start to come back, etc. And it's this wonderful evolution of how in and out groups, seating patterns, etc. But this was from 8 years of observations and then producing the work afterwards. So from a practical point of view, there's no practical use of this. It's incredibly interesting, but it took too long. You couldn't do this with an organization, and because you get the results several years later, and everything will have moved on. So how do we collect data? This is a really important thing. So we champion active ONA. There's passive ONA, which is data mining. And then there is active ONA, which is whereby we ask a very simple survey question. We collect the data through a very traditional way. So whereas passive ONA really looks at quantity and activity, we actually look at quantity and quality. You know, it's not just about how much communication or interaction there is, but it's what is the topic of that communication. So how often do you speak to people about work-related topics? So we define the quality of the we directly ask participants' intent rather than inferring it. We can get actual strengths from participants and benchmarking against their network. We don't look at activity. Active ONA is only about how the participant is going in and out, and that's data mining, and you don't get the quality behind that. So for us, we think that using active ONA is a much more compliant way of gathering the data. It gives us much more depth, and it gives us much more use cases. The use cases for passive ONA track activity, whether it's going up or whether it's going down. So it normally fits within retention, or the quiet quits, people that are slowing down, are they going to leave? And that's where passive ONA. But the two are so different, even though they've got ONA in the title, they should really be considered two different things, and they really are. They can be run together to add value, but they're two very different offerings, even though they both fall within the organizational network analysis area. And so what does this look when we bring it to life? It's important to know how the data is actually collected. So you can see from this question, how often do you communicate with the following individuals about work-related topics at your company? individual fills this in. It's like, I speak to this person very often or not very often, or I do not know this person. Well, all of that very valid. And if we have one person that does that, we can have a look at where their connections are, and you can see the arrows are going out. Very simple. A lot of clever algorithms behind this that comes through in a second, but we treat everybody within this network as a peer. Next person completes based on their thoughts and sentiments, and that maps in. Then we have the third person and the fourth person, and we're able to overlay this. Clever mathematics kicks in, which have been developed over the last 3 to 4 decades and plugged into something that can generate this quickly now with the computing and technology that's come through. And that allows us to actually define the network and the positioning. And there's elements of like gravitational pull here. So the spatial layout actually has an impact here, where there's bigger space. As an individual that has strong connections within the network, they have a bigger gravitational pull. It pulls people towards you. And you can see like how these planets are orbiting around each other, but they're obviously not planets, they're people. So you're getting this spatial awareness of your human of your people capital, your social capital, the engine. So we don't just look at one question and one network, but it's one question per network. So from one question, unlike a psychometric, which asks lots of questions to one person, this is one person to one question to lots of people. And we're able to map out slightly more exact science. Reliability is a moot point because we expect this to change. With personality, we're wanting to see more consistency. And actually, the fourth dimension is really important to us. So we can look at 2D graphs, which we've looked at before. We actually have 3D graphs, which I'll show you very shortly. But to us, the fourth dimension is the most important as well, and that's time. So we want to see the 3D location of how people are interacting with each other, but how is that evolving over time? So this is not a snapshot. It's a time 1, time 2, time 3. Everybody's treated equally, so we use information such as seniority, location, ethnicity, that can come in secondary. This is a human being network. Everybody's a person. How are you connecting? How are you interacting? And as a result, it becomes quite hard to manipulate because you can only really manipulate your side. I can say that I speak to everybody and manipulate it, but then it also relies on 50% of what everybody else says about me as well. So it reduces the risks of nonsense input. And because the questions are so neutral, there isn't really the motivation to manipulate. And it also, because people know that they are being measured on some of these things, it has a positive impact in helping people to actually behave in those ways because they know they're being measured on it. So I'm going to introduce a few little case studies, and then I'm going to bring out, and then we're going to open it up for some questions. So a pain point. So an organization suspected that there was issues with cohesion and collaboration within the project involving 3 separate business functions. So this is real data. We looked at the trust network and who are the individuals that you trust to openly share information with the most. That was our question. So it's sharing information, it's quantity, but there's quality there. This is about who you trust, and it's who you will openly share information with. And when we look at groups A, B, and C, you can see that the trust network looks pretty well connected. But what's interesting is with trust is we're looking at mutual trust. So I can trust that person, but does that person trust me? And when you remove the links that are only one way, we actually end up with this much more diffuse, less dense network. And you can see that whoever is person 24, in terms of mutual trust, there is no mutual trust between them and the rest of their team. They are very isolated, and you're starting to see that there's a very different pattern of information happening behind here. So we're getting a good idea of the mutual trust network for this one's as a group. And we are able to then have a look at this from the individual perspective, but also the network perspective, so the human capital perspective and the social capital perspective. So we can see that there is trust between business functions, but the mutual trust is not as strong. Got one individual in group pre that has no mutual trust with their team. So what sort of environment is being created there? How are people feeling about that? And able to then take positive action to help improve the levels of cohesion, collaboration, and actively make decisions around helping to try and build more mutual trust rather than just leaving it all to chance. If we have a look at another element here, we have a large infrastructure project with two companies that are working together for the first time. They have two different skills within construction. They're coming into work on constructing the same thing with their two different skills. There was worries that there were signs of issues with collaboration and low social capital, low collaboration, poor working together can lead to hugely expensive errors. If things aren't perfectly aligned, this is a mega project. You know, this wasn't the example, but if you're building train lines and they don't meet exactly, it costs millions of dollars to go back and correct errors of that nature. So we looked at cohesion with sentiment analysis. And the question that we asked was select up to 30 people that you communicate with frequently regarding work-related topics. So that was what we looked at here. And then when we have a look at between company A and company B, you can see that there's a lot of mixed up elements between the blue and the yellow, which looks strong on the surface. But the cohesion between Group A is quite low. There's only about 14% of connections existing. And it's 17% or 17.9% for Group B. And you see that the collaboration is a lot less there. So we've got statistics and numbers behind the visuals, but as a snapshot, it's impossible to say anything more about this. It is. I mean, we're making a big jump. So we would possibly in a network of this size expect cohesion to be higher in A and B, and it's possibly more towards 25 to 50%, but it's in the teens for both of them. But when this really comes to life is if we have a look at the sentiment analysis. So we have open-ended questions to get information from the group and from the network. And when we have a look at the sentiment analysis in terms of, you know, how do people think the partnership is going, we get quite an even mix. You know, about 15.7% is quite positive about the partnership, 12.7% quite mixed, and 11.8% are quite skeptical about the partnership. So quite similar size of groupings. And we're able to take that sentiment analysis and actually look at it from in terms of where people are within the network. So you can see here that the people that are more skeptical about the partnership, they're much more central to the network. So they're much more influential. So what we're able to see here is the average is 80 for a score of centrality. So you have highly influential individuals that are being far more skeptical. And the people that are being more positive tend to be more at the periphery of the network. So you've got this element of toxicity in the middle where it's influential and it's starting to spread out. The people that are positive about the partnership are more to the edge of the network, and they're possibly sitting in they don't care, they don't mind, or a bit of ignorance is bliss that they're not realizing. And the more influential people are pumping out much more negative sentiment about what's happening. And this is a concern. So if we take this a bit further, so you know, you're able to address this early in the partnership, and they have done for this particular example. They could see that sentiment to the partnership was falling apart. We have this idea of social contagion, which is the spreading of sentiment, very much like COVID. COVID spreads on contact, so does engagement, so does disengagement. If you have somebody that's highly engaged in an organization, it spreads to the people around them. And if you have people that are highly disengaged in the organization, it will spread to the people around them. So the organization was able to take affirmative action to start to address this early before it became too much of a problem, before the really influential people who happen to be quite senior in this case, to address the negativity that were pumping in and influencing their colleagues unduly. So for our last example that we have here, as we sort of look at it in action before I show you some of our graphs, we had a large financial institution. It had gone through, it acquired a lot of organizations. This particular example is based in Europe. We looked at 6 different networks. And here's an example of some of the questions. So, please select up to 15 colleagues you trust the most. Please select up to 15 colleagues that you seek customer related advice from. And we were really having a look at top management productivity through this. So here's the network you can see, and you can see the business unit 1, 2, 3, 4, areas that have been acquired. There's quite a bit of siloing in these areas that have been acquired. And we've had a look at the interactions between the top management across these business units. And when we have a look at the CEOs, so there's a group of CEOs running these companies, and then we have a look at their N-1s that are supporting to run these companies, you see that the cohesion can vary quite a lot. And the one that really stands out for us is in here. Now, you'd like to have these a bit higher, but you've got these 5 CEOs who do communicate with each other, so they do speak, but they don't ask each other for advice. And it's quite a lonely place being the leader of an organization, being in the CEO role. You don't get many peers and support networks around you. But here you have a group of other CEOs in the same group, other business units that could be that support network. And this is something that needs to be built. They're missing out on this interaction. And without having a look at the network analysis, this wouldn't have been immediately obvious. You can see that it's a bit stronger with the N-1s across these areas as well. So if we start to bring that out, yeah. So the innovation hubs are small and sparse. There's little communication between them. We need to start to work on that. The CEOs do not appear to be using themselves as a collective pool of resource for advice and support. They haven't got many peers to lean on. Here's a great resource and opportunity that's just not being used. And how can we look at action plans to enhance collaboration and innovation? So running of time 2 is underway at the moment. But the big thing here is, this is not a surprise when you have mergers and acquisitions to have groups that are siloed. It's not that that's bad, that's to be expected. But how can we now positively put things in action to help bring people closer together? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and just shift over to our platform to bring this more to life. If I can find, where's it gone? There we go. So I couldn't see it. It popped up on the Zoom. So organizational network analysis is helping us have a look at the social capital between people. It's a relatively new field, but I think it has a lot of value, and certainly don't have all the answers at the moment. But by using technology, we're able to start bringing these areas to life and start to make much more informed decisions. So you can see here within our system, we have a particular group. We've got the communication network, and this is real data. It's been anonymized and is part of our demo platform. So we've got the communication network for this group, and we've got customer insight for this group. I can scroll over the individuals. The names have been changed. It has been anonymized. And you can see from a customer insight perspective that this individual, Danny, is sharing a lot of customer insight, and there's a little bit coming in. If I come to the edge, you can see that this individual is just receiving a bit. And if I come more central, you can see this person is fascinating. This person has a lot coming into them, but nothing going out. So customer insight is flowing to Ralph, but Ralph isn't sharing customer insight. This could be context driven because of their role, what they're doing. But if you understand the context of the organization, you can go a lot deeper and understand what's happening. We can add all of the dots to this as well to see if I speed this up, intuitively, you can see that there's a lot more density of customer sharing here. And as you move out towards the edges, that density becomes less, which gives us insight. And then we also, I'm going to do something a little odd. I'm going to change this to white, which will make sense in a second. I can then want to have a look at the 2D, but let me move to the 3D. And here you've got the 3D, and this looks like a galaxy far, far away, but you can see that there's two individuals that are completely isolated. So customer insight, they're not receiving any, they're not sharing any. In this particular example, I think we changed the department name, but they're actually the business development team. So you've got the business development team, you've got two individuals that are not sharing anything or receiving anything, far too much internal competition. And from the 2D, you can start to see from the 3D that you get a perspective, an extra perspective that you might not get from the 2D to see how things are forming. Is there greater gaps? If I switch to communication, you can see that it gets a little bit tighter, which is not a surprise because communication tends to be the tightest because it's a general question about work-related activity. So if I come back out, I can show you a slightly larger network as well. So this particular network has 1,019 people in it. This is actually the case study with the CEOs that we looked at just before. And you can see that you're not going to be able to interpret anything immediately from this, but this is why we are able to bring metrics in, diameter, density, fragmentation. We look at collaboration, cohesion. I won't bore you all with this right now, but we can dig in. We've got the numbers and the visual. And if I come and have a look at this particular group here, this is the 2D, but if I go 3D, suddenly I get an extra little dimension. I can spin this round. All of a sudden I realize that there's a big tail out the back here. It looks a bit like a shark. As I've got this big tail out the back, I can have a little look at where everything's positioned. If I zoom in, I can see that there's actually only a very few number of people that are actually connecting the whole of this silo into the central system. And this is giving us much more insight into how our people are coming together, how they're working together, and what's actually happening on the surface. So I am going to pause there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for joining. Been a pleasure to introduce you to the some of the foundations of where organizational network analysis has come from, introduce you to some of the concepts of the history behind it and some of the reasons why it's only really coming to the fore at the moment, being able to combine technology with the data, the algorithms. It is still evolving. It is not an off-the-shelf solution, but it gives very rich data. So I will be quiet now for a little bit. Welcome any questions, thoughts. Please do fire away. Yes, Dr. Aditi, I see you got your hand up.
I do. Thank you for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I loved it. And I have some idea of ONA, but I've never actually seen it come alive like this. So that was wonderful. Thank you. I have just one big question, and that is, do you look at demographic data? Do you look at why there are silos? And if you do look at demographic data, are there any patterns that you see across organizations? Are there groups of people or, identity groups that don't? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That actually prompts me to come back here because I actually missed out showing you little parts, which actually answers the question. So for us, I would call that the filtering factors. It might not be the best expression. It's probably an internal one. I need to think of a better marketing expression for it. But we think about individuals. This is a human. These are human beings forming a network. So we just start with everybody being a peer. But what we do afterwards is then we can start to have a look at things that come afterwards. So we can start to retrospectively apply filters into areas that we're interested in. So this is looking at department, but we can look at gender. So here we can see where the male and the female elements are. I can also look at grade. So for this particular organization, they had grades 1 to 7, and I can see the seniority here. If I move to a different project that has some slightly different filters, I come into this one. This is our demo platform. You know, okay, that only has one. That's a very bad example. I'm sorry. But I can also resize for social quotient metrics as well. So every individual has the same size circle here, but we can change the size of the circle to help us interpret the data. So we don't want to go crazy with this. We can look at seniority, ethnicity, location, department, whichever the filters are that are specifically important to that network. And we can also look at changing some of the sizes with regards to what we call social quotient metrics. So this is the measure of the ability of the individual to influence the network and also get resource from the network, whether it's knowledge, experience. And the larger dots here, you can see this particular person, Aaron, much larger dot, much more central. And you can see that some people, even though this person looks quite central, they're not. If you turn this 3D, they're probably more towards the back. And this is where the 2D elements can sort of trick you. So when we work with an organization, these filtering factors are one of our first, most important questions. We'll look at the people network, but you need to tell us what's going on. So how do you define a network? That's also very unique as well. It's subjective. So there's consultative bit at the beginning. It's very similar to a high-performing network, high-performing team, in my opinion. It's a group of people that are coming together to try and achieve something. And that definition fits for an entire organization. Could be 10,000 people. You're not going to know all of the 9,999 other people, but you're still part of the same network trying to achieve that strategic objective. But you can go to smaller networks, to departments, to teams. And then in this particular group, we had country. You can't see it as well here, but if I zoom in, you can start to see that the numbering, we can have a look at gender, so we can see the male and female spread, which is a bit more obvious. And so this is how we would approach this. And I would say that this is the most important second step, making sure you've got the right filters to be looking at. If you're thinking about diversity and inclusion, then the metrics here are really important. You might have the diversity, but is there the integration? If all of your different dots for your different diversity groups are all clustered together so that you see an entire mass of blue, an entire mass of red, and an entire mass of orange, you might have the diversity, but you don't have the inclusion. You still probably have your 50 plus white British men all sat in the middle, making all the decisions still. So shine a light. And we actually made a mistake on this when we started to bring this out, because we sort of came with it as like, isn't this amazing? You can have a look everywhere. You can shine a light. You can see how your people things. And that was our metric. And then we realized that not everybody in an organization wants to shine a light in all of the corners. So how can we come with it with a little bit more softer questions to start with? So the communication question isn't threatening. We have a question that, how often do you go to people for work-related advice? That's not threatening. And also we want to do time 1, time 2, time 3. So we build up a level of maturity for people's understanding of the tool. And then we can go a little bit deeper. We can look at innovation networks. How often do you share? How often do you communicate about, new and exciting ideas or innovative ideas? And we're not trying to be clever with the questions. It can be an innovation question. It can say innovation. I'm not trying to trick anybody. We want to know whether they are talking about innovative ideas with colleagues, and then build up. And then it's the blend of the networks as well. And within the system, you can actually look at the 2 different networks side by side. So you can have a look at communication and you can have a look at advice, and you can see how they meet, because they'll be different, but with the same people. And that gives fascinating insight into, you could have a department that's really, highly communicating with each other. But when you look at the advice network, they're not really asking each other for advice. So they're talking to each other, but not about getting advice. It's missing. So how can we then help that organization? So hopefully that answered your excellent question. Sorry, Dr. Aditi. It was a long answer. Apologies.
No, that was very helpful. I just have one follow-up to that. Just as you mentioned, the questions that you asked, do you validate those questions before you roll them out to people in the organization, to run focus groups? Like, what do you do with the questions? How do you decide which items to include and which ones to not?
So we have our core questions that we would pick out in our standard questions, and sometimes people ask for ones that are when it comes to choosing the right networks, we have to consult with the organization. We never will understand the organization as much as the organization. So what I do find is that it's like your own body. If you wake up in the morning and your shoulder hurts, you know that your shoulder hurts, but you're not entirely sure why. And I think business leaders are similar when you apply the same, body idea, but to the network. The network is a living, breathing entity, and the senior leaders actually know where the pain is, and in this case, the shoulder, but they don't know whether it's bone, muscle, tendon, ligament, bruise, and we have to go and get a diagnosis. And this is where organizational network can come in to do the diagnosis. So it's normally a case of, where do you think your pain points are? And they can actually start to provide that. So you have to consult. And then they might be thinking, it's a pain, but is it a 2 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10? I'm not sure. And it's the same with your shoulder. You've got to go check. And then once we basically do an X-ray and have a look at what's there, the first question isn't necessarily, is that good or bad? It's like, how has this maybe happened? I've experienced this a lot. I've checked with partners and they've experienced this a lot. If you're sitting and showing an organization their network results and you've got more than one of them in the room, give it anywhere between 2 to 10 minutes for them to understand what they're seeing. And then I can't get a word in edgeways, because they're the two people or plus know their organization so well. The hypotheses start coming out. They point at this, they point at that. Oh, we had this issue and this is blah, blah, blah. And it's great. And actually your job then becomes to sort of, let's not overinterpret to start with, but it's good. Let's look at what has influenced how this is formed. Start with structural, because it's quick win. Start with process and policy before we jump into the people. And actually their brains do sort of go that way as well. They sort of know what's wrong, etc. And that's how it spirals out. So there's a consultative process at the beginning, and then it's a consultative process at the end. And then we try and make the middle bit as self-service as possible. And actually doesn't become about the tool. It becomes about the problem and the solution to the problem, which resonates with people a lot more.
Thank you so much. That was really
No,
helpful.
thank you. Okay.
Okay, so I think we are all on the top of the hour. So I think I'm getting quite a few messages that I need to get off, and I have a call. So I'll just quickly step in and say thank you so much, Andrew. I think that was a very interesting session. I think it's as interesting as any of the other sessions I've attended of yours, and it's always something that leaves me with a lot to think about. And I do want to put this out here for all of you who've joined today, that, Andrew, has a lot of information, and his organization also has a lot to share about this. So feel free to connect with him on LinkedIn. And from my experience, he's always been very generous in sharing his wisdom and knowledge. So, feel free to reach out to him, connect with him. And if you have some places where you feel this would be useful, then this is, again, do connect with him. He and his team will help you set this up for any project that you feel might be useful. And they'll also guide you in how you could use it for certain projects, especially large team coaching projects. Extremely useful there. Yeah. So thank you so much, Andrew, for taking time, coming in and
absolute pleasure. I think I'm still the host, so I've got a question here, so I can answer the questions that's on the side if you want.
Yes.
Everyone else can disappear or listen as they wish. So I'll stick on, and there's one question in the chat, so I'll answer that, and then we can finish. Or if anyone wants any questions, I'm very happy to overrun.
So if anybody wants to stay back, feel do. I think Binay's got a question. He's got his hand up. Yeah, but if
sure.
anybody,
And I'm thinking I'm the host as well. So if you have to leave, Rachel, absolutely fine. I'll hang on here and have fun with that.
All right. Hey, Andrew, can you see me?
Hi, Binay. Yes.
Good. Thank you so much. Good. Thank you so much for conducting these sessions. I'm very intrigued and thank you, Rachel, for conducting this ONA session. I'm a ICF team coach certified, and I do come from management consulting background with KPMG. So I have done similar what Andrew mentioned altogether. So a couple of questions. First, can we get that PDF or PPT?
Yes, of course you can.
All right. Second is, Rachel mentioned it's good for a large group of, team coaching. I understand. So is there any benchmark that when we go to an organization, I assume it would be an expensive tool to use and that would be bear by the client by the end of the day. Will there be any specific employee in a company or firm that we should look at first before deploying this tool?
Sure. Well, good news is because we use the technology, it's relatively cost effective. So I want to put that out there. This is we're talking either single figure dollars or double figure dollars per head, depending on the size of the network. So it's really not crazy. So that's a good thing to start with. So we really want to focus on supporting SMEs, etc. I mean, so that don't go into the details of the commercial stuff, but it's not expensive, I should point out. We're trying to make it as cost effective as possible. And you mentioned about coaching and coaches, and it's one of the questions in the chat as well about how this could be beneficial to you as coaches. So if you see that if you're coaching an individual, you're focusing a lot on the human capital, obviously, is the individual, their growth, their career. I mean, career is kind of half and half. It's not about just the resource, it's about helping the individual be the best they can. But that does also translate to being the best resource they can be, but also happy. But then equally, you've got to split it into two. You focus on the individual, what they can do, how they can do it, how can they get ahead, how can they interact. But it talks about then, what is their influence within the network? Where do they sit with the people around them? If you're coaching an individual, understanding where they sit within their immediate network puts even more depth into the psychometric or the 360 or the other diagnostic data that you've got. And because we got a social quotient score, your social quotient score, your ability to influence and get resource from the network is actually a human capital metric. It's an individual, it's how central you are, how much you reach out, how many people come to you, but it's the bridge. It's a human capital measure, but it's a bridge into social capital. Because if you're increasing the social quotient of everybody in the organization, your social capital by definition is going to increase. It's not quite one-to-one, it's not as beautiful as that, but you can see that if you're connecting more people together, their ability to influence the network, get more resource, etc., starts to come through. But not everybody wants to be connected to everybody else. Not some people, everything is context driven. So to understand the context of your coachee's position within the team, within the network, how people are around them, it doesn't just give you depth, it gives you a whole second piece of information alongside the human capital information. And when you put the two together, you get the whole picture and you can help that individual get to where they want to get to quicker. It's how ultimately it's how people around them see them that dictates how well they do. If they get a positive reputation, they're going to be able to lead and manage better. If they've got a negative reputation, no matter how brilliant or whatever they do, they're just going to keep tripping themselves up. So understanding their position within the network, how their team, if you're coaching a leader, they need to know how their team are interacting. They might have weaknesses that they hadn't even realized. And so for me, it's a much deeper, holistic ability to be able to coach the individual from a environment perspective, from a performance perspective, and completely complements everything else. It's extra. It doesn't interfere with everything else. It's all connected. So that would be a long but overall answer.
Perfect. I think that summarizes the power of this tool. I think there are similar tools like org view and everything, but they're more on the org structure rather than the ONA. So it would be really helpful for team coaches all together and then use this tool and see the network. Really appreciate for today's session.
No, but you can use the network just to look at one person as well, where you had people like with executive search. This is a completely different concept, but to me, they commit to helping that person be successful, and if they're not successful within 6 months and they leave, then they invest time to find somebody else free of charge. So it's in their interests to understand how that person is integrating into the network, and equally it's a huge value add to their own services to give social capital information. It's not the same context, but just as an example of how one person can, it can be used for the whole team, but with a particular focus on one person.
Perfect. Makes sense then. And do you have more features in the Menti tool apart from ONA?
We do. We have personality assessment that's linked in with this as well, based on the 5-factor model going to hexaco, so introduces the concept of sincerity. We avoid labeling as well, so less around percentiles. We actually go, it's personality spectrum is it's a behavioral spectrum. So as you move towards the edges, our scale is balanced in the middle. A lot of people use average, and not a big fan of that, because average doesn't imply optimal, and optimal it can be if it's balanced. And then as you move towards the edges, you go to moderate and then to strong. And where you're strong, it means that the strengths of your positives are exaggerated and the strengths of the negatives are exaggerated. And it becomes much more context driven about whether it's a good alignment or bad alignment. And if you change the context, it can flip on its head. So we want to use that personality data in there, and then 360 as well, etc. So it's not just about the network. This is just one area. We want to be looking at more holistically about actually what's influenced how this network has actually formed is probably our biggest question.
Perfect. Makes sense. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Rachel.
Pleasure. Just reading the comments, sorry. I think that might be it. Thank you, everybody.
So Yatish has a question.
Hi, Andrew.
Oh, yes,
Hi.
Yatish, thank you.
Yeah, hi. My name is Yatish. I'm a coach and a leadership consultant. I've done some amount of work around building trust. Okay, and I was trying to look at what you showed. Of course, this is really fascinating, right? I was trying to look at how this tool fits into an organization, perhaps looking at building trust. So here are some of my views and observations and a question. So I believe that in an organization, influence can work in any different direction, regardless of hierarchy, right? One. So in order to capture influence in an organization, I know you're capturing communication, collaboration, and all of that. So my question is about how often do you really how often do you really ask these questions to the participants, and how long are these questionnaires? Because you said there's just 1 or 2 questions each time. So how crafted, how well crafted are these questionnaires for you to be able to capture all those nuances that come into play in an influence?
Yeah, influence is a great one to ask, because we'd look at a combination of networks, but we'd also ask an influence question as well from sentiments. So if you've got, say you've got a network with 100 people, and you ask the question, how often do you communicate about work-related topics? You'll get a list of 99 other people, because you're one of the people in the network, and then you have to answer about the other people. You're not going to know everybody. There's going to be, so it's going to take you somewhere between only 2 to 5 minutes to complete that, depending on how quickly you read. And you can pick out the people you do know, and everybody else can be don't. And then you move to the next network question: how often do you go to these people for advice about work-related topics? And so if you've got 3 networks with 100 people, you're talking anywhere between 6 to 15 minutes. So not a huge time investment to get all that rich information. If the network goes bigger to say 200, 300, 400 people, nobody knows all of those people. And in fact, it doesn't matter what the size of the network is. The reality is anywhere between 10 to 20 is probably the max of who you actually have a strong connection with. It's probably 10 to 15, to be honest with you. So at this point, we say, up to 15 people identify to the most when it gets to bigger numbers. And that keeps the time down to similar. Because then and we have little clever filters, so you can type in names or organize by department, so you can jog your memory, just make sure you haven't forgotten anybody. But the reality is, if you've forgotten them, then it's probably evidence towards not being the strongest of connections. So you get that nice filter thing that comes through. So that's that from that focus. And then if you're looking at, say, influence, people that are more central in the network are more influential. So if the context is communication, this is somebody that has, and I don't say they're more influential, sorry, I say they've got the potential to be more influential, because they're more connected. If they want to pass information left to right, they have a greater ability to do so. But they also have the potential to be influential that isn't necessarily positive, because if they are a bad actor, then they can hold information back. They can be a gatekeeper. They have the influence and the power to do so. So we shouldn't just always assume we have a natural disposition as human beings to view networks slightly more positively, and we have a natural disposition to view personality and psychometrics more negatively. And by negative, I mean picking out the weaknesses, whereas in networks we have a natural disposition to pick out the positives. I don't know why, it's not my area of expertise, but that does seem to come through. And then we can also ask about sentiment of influence as well. You know, how influential do you think these people are within the network? And that gives us a very interesting thing about what people actually think, but then we can compare it to what's actually happening. Do we see if there's a disconnect? It'd be fascinating to see if that's together. And it's just that richness of information to help us get greater insight into what that actually means and how that actually happens. So we can look at influence on the individual level, but then we can actually ask people as well and see how aligned that is to what's actually forming. So that would be how I would approach that. We call it like a little cocktail of networks. You can mix the networks together to make a wonderful cocktail that really works, and we'll have some off the show. You can also mix them together that don't tell you anything and taste horrendous. So we work together to make sure that this network combination is blended to exactly the medicine that they need.
Sure, I have a follow-up question. So if I'm looking at using this tool in, let's say, a team or a group coaching context, is there a possibility for someone to actually sandbox this tool to wrap their heads around it, even for me as a coach? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so the system I showed you before was our demo platform, so people can go in there, play, look around. We'll share the presentation as well, and then we've also got other presentations. We try not to duplicate, etc. We got one that goes a bit deeper on productivity, and we've got ones that are slightly more around introductions as well. And we also run certification courses, which are 3 times 2.5 hours. Rachel attended, Sunil's very kindly attended as well. To just give you insight, there's no actual charge for those courses at the moment. We're seeing this as an education piece. The market is not aware or as mature to this because it's so new, which is fine, as absolutely understandable. And we want to educate people on this. We think it can add real value. We don't have all the answers yet, but we like to work with people that are early adopters that can see the value of where this is going and help us build use cases with the solutions that we have here.
Sure, Andrew, thanks. I'll reach out to you on LinkedIn perhaps, and we'll take it from there. Thanks,
Yes,
Andrew.
please
Thanks,
do.
Rachel.
Sorry, I just want to say, I'm not going to take your time, but I just want to say that I am an organizational psychologist. I'm trained as one and I've worked as one. So I see a lot of different use cases, and my mind is just firing, question after question. Is it okay if I join one of your trainings, or is there a way maybe we can chat later and I can ask more questions? Because the contextual part is really calling out to me, especially in India. I'm starting to think about, well, we also have a lot of social hierarchies in India. And I think that, especially in the current climate, this could be such a useful tool, because that would then really throw light on where these social hierarchies are siloed within the organization.
Yes, you'd be more than welcome at the training. I'll coordinate with Rachel on how we pass that over. And I'm not sure what the protocol is, but we can provide that direct or through Rachel, or whichever's most appropriate.
Andrew, maybe if you could, if somebody in your team could send me the dates, I'll send it out to the entire group, because I have a feeling there might be a few other people who might be interested as well.
Count me in as well.
There. And
Great. More the merrier.
We have quite a few people who've dropped off now, but I'm guessing that, there might be other people interested as well. So I'll pass it on to the entire mailing list, and I from what I remember, there's a calendar so people can pick which month.
Correct. Yes. And we have a course time that's suitable for Europe and a course time that's suitable for the Far East, and people in the Middle East and Southeast Asia South Asia can normally straddle both, so you've probably got a choice. The time zones just work out nicely.
Where are you located, Andrew, by the way?
I'm normally located in Bangkok. I'm speaking to you from Dubai today, which is where I spend a lot of time in Dubai and Bangkok, and sort of travel between the two, and then everywhere in between and out as well.
Maybe you can take a flyover in Bangalore and conduct a session in India as well.
I'd be delighted. It would be our first in person, actually, if you wanted that. I'd be delighted.
Perhaps you can come to, or perhaps you come to Hyderabad as well. I'm in Hyderabad, by the way.
Okay, okay. No, brilliant. Be delighted to, and be delighted to welcome you. I lead the courses as well, so you'd have, if you're willing to put up with me for 3 times 2.5 hours, I've already taken an extra 20 minutes of your time here now. I do normally run those ones on time.
That's
Great. So
something
we'll get that
very
information over to Rachel, and we'll get that distributed out, and it would be delighted to welcome all and every one of you to the courses that are most convenient for you.
Right. And you'll send me the slides as well. I think quite a few people will.
Yes.
Right.
Let me make a little note of that as well. Yes, definitely the slides as well.
Yeah, so I will send that out to people, and I'll also send out the dates. I remember getting it as a series of options to pick from, a series of dates to pick from, and time slots to pick from. So I think people can pick whatever works for them. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks, Andrew.
Pleasure. Thanks for your questions. Nice to meet everyone. Rachel, sorry, I apologize.
Not at all. I'm just loving the energy that's got created, and I see so much, excitement and interest. So thank you for, spending that extra time and being willing to do that and being so generous about it as well. So like I said earlier, that's what I tell people, reach out to Andrew. I've always found you very generous with your, wisdom, your experience, your time. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I love it. It'd be an absolute delight to be invited. Thank you so much.
All right.
I wish you all a very lovely evening and rest of the day.
Take care, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And all the best for your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Take care of yourself.
Speak
Bye-bye.
soon. Thanks very much. Bye.